December 1770, a blizzard rages across Quebec. Through the storm, two American armies advance, ragged, starving, desperate, their commanders dreaming of adding Canada to the Revolution. One will fall in the snow, struck down by grape shot. Another will limp away wounded but unbroken. And in the shadows of ancient stone walls, a bold gamble will collapse into disaster. This is the forgotten story of America's first invasion of Canada, a campaign of hope, courage, and tragedy buried beneath the winter storm. The year was 1763, and the great struggle known as the 7 Years' War had just ended. Britain emerged triumphant, its red-coated armies stretching influence across oceans, continents, and empires. But with victory came complications. Among the spoils was a vast, snowbound territory Canada ripped from French control and absorbed into the British crown. Overnight, Britain inherited not just land, but people tens of thousands of French-speaking Catholics who had little reason to feel loyalty toward London. This uneasy acquisition festered beneath the surface. French Canadians clung to their language, their church, and their traditions. To the Americans watching from the South, these disaffected communities looked like a potential ally. To Britain, they were a liability that might rebel if stirred. It was a dangerous tension simmering just as the first sparks of revolution were beginning to glow in the 13 colonies. By the spring of 1775, those sparks had flared into open fire. The battles of Lexington and Concord marked the birth of the American Revolution. Across the colonies, militias mobilized and the Continental Congress scrambled to give structure to the rebellion. Leaders knew they faced not only the might of Britain, but also the uncertainty of geography, and Canada loomed to the north like both an opportunity and a threat. If Loyalist forces were allowed to gather there, they could strike down into New York and New England. If Canada could be persuaded to join the Patriot cause, however, Britain would be denied a crucial foothold on the continent. It was with this vision that the Continental Congress drafted a letter on May 29, 1775. Addressed to the oppressed inhabitants of Canada, the words carried the fiery rhetoric of liberty that had already begun to define the Revolution. Join with us, they urged, in the defense of our common liberty. The appeal was direct, passionate, and almost desperate, an invitation for French Canadians to seize their own destiny alongside the 13 rebelling colonies. But the letter fell flat. The people of Quebec and Montreal did not rise. No militias rallied under the stars and stripes. The silence was deafening. For Congress, it was a bitter reminder that lofty words did not easily translate into action across cultural and linguistic divides. Still, the dream of Canada did not die. The vision of bringing the northern colony into the fold of revolution was too strategic and too tempting to abandon. When the letter failed, others began to whisper of more forceful measures. Why wait for the French Canadians to volunteer when American armies could march north and liberate them by sword? It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty, failed diplomacy, and growing ambition that two figures stepped forward with daring proposals: Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. Each had already made a name for himself at the head of ragged, daring troops. Each carried a vision of striking deep into enemy territory. And each would play a pivotal role in shaping what came next, the decision to launch a campaign into Canada itself. The stage was set. On paper, it seemed impossible, a young, undersupplied rebellion daring to invade the fortress cities of one of the world's greatest empires. But in 1775, as desperation and opportunity intertwined, the Continental Congress began to believe the unthinkable might just be achievable. This was the seed of an invasion, one born out of hope, miscalculation, and the restless ambition of men unwilling to wait for fortune's favor. What began with a letter would soon march under banners, bayonets, and the snow-driven winds of the Canadian wilderness. Ethan Allen was not a man of patience. Born in the rocky hills of Connecticut, he carried himself like the land that shaped him, rough, stubborn, and unyielding. By 1775, he had forged his own reputation as the leader of the Green Mountain Boys, a band of militiamen from the contested lands of present-day Vermont. These were men accustomed to hardship, farmers turned fighters used to brawling with surveyors and sheriffs over disputed property lines. Allen's voice was booming, his presence commanding, his temper quick to flare. He was in every sense a frontier warlord, exactly the kind of man the revolution needed in its reckless infancy. Benedict Arnold was different. Tall, proud, and ambitious Arnold was a merchant by trade, a man who had tasted prosperity and hungered for more. Where Allen thrived on brute force and charisma, Arnold possessed drive, cunning, and a sharp mind for tactics. Both men had recently tasted victory together at Fort Ticonderoga. In May 1775, they had led a daring raid against the British outpost in northern New York, seizing it in a pre-dawn attack. The victory, though small, electrified the Patriot cause. It gave them cannon's prestige and a sense of possibility. But for Allen and Arnold, it was more than a trophy. It was a glimpse northward. Ticonderoga was a gateway. Beyond it lay Lake Champlain, the road to Montreal, and the greater prize of Canada itself. These men were restless and bold, and they saw what Congress hesitated to acknowledge. If the rebellion stayed contained to the 13 colonies, it would forever be boxed in by British strongholds. To survive the revolution needed to expand its horizons. Allen and Arnold carried this conviction to the halls of the Continental Congress. The politicians, ever cautious, had nearly abandoned the dream after the unanswered letter to the French Canadians. But Allen and Arnold pleaded, persuaded, and pressed their case. They spoke of opportunity of striking before Britain could reinforce Quebec, of the weakness of Carleton's defenses, and slowly the idea took hold. At the same time, across the St. Lawrence River, the British governor of Canada, General Guy Carleton, was playing his own dangerous game of assumption. Carleton, a seasoned officer, believed he understood the French Canadians under his rule. To him, they were practical, if not entirely loyal. Surely, he reasoned, the Catholic seigneurs and their tenant farmers would rally to the king's banner if the colonies to the south erupted in open rebellion. Confident in this belief, Carleton made a fateful decision. He detached 2 battalions from his already limited forces and sent them east to reinforce General Gage in Boston. In doing so, he gambled with the defense of Canada. Carleton believed he could raise a new regiment of French Canadians to replace the troops he had sent away. But reality cut differently. When his officers attempted recruitment drives, they met with indifference. At best, hostility, at worst. The habitants, the French-speaking farmers who formed the backbone of Canadian society, were not eager to trade their fields for muskets. They were weary of imperial politics, reluctant to shed blood for a crown that had already changed from French to British in living memory. Their loyalties were tangled, uncertain, and far less reliable than Carleton imagined. This failure to rally French-Canadian support was not just a political embarrassment, it was a strategic disaster. By the time Carleton realized he had miscalculated, his defenses were stretched thin. His army, already modest in size, now stood exposed. To the Americans, this weakness appeared like a door left ajar. Congress, spurred by Allen and Arnold's urgency, began to think in terms of opportunity rather than risk. On June 27, 1775, they made their decision. An invasion would be launched. The plan was ambitious in its simplicity. Richard Montgomery, an Irish-born officer with experience in the British Army, would lead a column north to seize Montreal, while Benedict Arnold would march separately to Quebec City. If successful, the 2 forces would converge, cracking open Canada's 2 greatest cities, like twin jewels added to the Patriot crown. The announcement sent ripples through the colonies. Some celebrated the boldness of the move, others whispered doubts. Could a fledgling army, barely organized, truly conquer a foreign province against one of the world's most disciplined militaries? But in the heat of revolution, doubts were often drowned by daring. The Americans had already shocked the world by standing against Britain at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. Why not add Montreal and Quebec to that list of miracles? For Allen and Arnold, this was vindication. Their restless energy had carried the day. Yet fate would test them in ways neither could imagine. The invasion of Canada would prove not just a trial of armies, but of leadership endurance and the fragile line between triumph and disaster. General Carleton, meanwhile, prepared as best he could. Though stripped of reinforcements and betrayed by his assumptions about French loyalty, he was not a man to surrender easily. He began fortifying Quebec, the ancient walled city perched above the St. Lawrence, whose stone battlements had already withstood sieges in centuries past. He knew winter would soon descend, and with it the harshest ally the British could hope for the unforgiving Canadian wilderness itself. The stage was set: two American commanders hungry for glory, a British governor clinging to control, and a land divided in its sympathies. The coming campaign would be as much a war against nature and distance as against enemy soldiers. Yet in that summer of 1775, hope outweighed fear. The Americans believed they could bring Canada into their revolution. The British believed their walls and winters would hold. And the French Canadians, caught in the middle, wondered whose cause, if any, was worth shedding blood for. Thus, the invasion of Canada was not merely a clash of armies. It was a collision of assumptions, each side misjudging the other. For the Americans, Allen and Arnold had lit the torch of ambition. For Carleton, misplaced confidence had left cracks in the fortress. And soon, those cracks would be tested by the march of 700 men under Richard Montgomery. Richard Montgomery was not a man bred in the American colonies. He had been born in Ireland, raised under the Union Jack, and trained in the very army he now opposed. As a young officer, he had fought in the French and Indian War, serving the British crown with distinction. Yet by 1775, disillusionment had shifted his loyalties. Marriage to an American woman and a growing sympathy for the patriot cause convinced him to cast his fate with the revolution. Now at 40 years old, Montgomery was called upon to lead an invasion that seemed less like strategy and more like audacity, the conquest of Canada with just 700 men. It was an army in name, more than in form. These were volunteers, not professionals. Farmers who had traded plows for muskets, young men whose zeal often outweighed their discipline. Their equipment was mismatched, their supplies meager. Few had ever marched beyond their home counties, and yet here they were entrusted with a mission that would test even the finest soldiers of Europe. They were to take Montreal, one of Britain's key strongholds on the continent, and then march eastward toward Quebec. From the very beginning, the odds seemed stacked against Montgomery. Canada was not a land that yielded easily to invaders. Dense forests, endless rivers, and treacherous terrain formed natural defenses more formidable than walls. Winter came early, lingering like a curse over every campaign. To march northward was to march into hardship, cold hunger sickness, and the silent threat of ambush. Even so, Congress believed timing was on their side. Guy Carleton, the British governor, had weakened his garrisons by sending troops to Boston. The French Canadians had not rallied to the king. Montreal seemed vulnerable, a ripe fruit ready to be plucked. The hope, or perhaps the fantasy, was that a swift strike would topple British authority before reinforcements could arrive. Montgomery understood the stakes. He was no reckless adventurer like Allen, nor an ambitious firebrand like Arnold. He was measured, thoughtful, and painfully aware of the difficulties ahead. Yet he also knew the revolution could not afford hesitation. If America was to be free, bold strokes would be required and fortune would have to be seized before it slipped away. So, in the summer of 1775, Montgomery began his march northward, his men tramping through the wilderness with banners snapping in the wind. Spirits were high at first. Many believed they were liberators, that the French Canadians would welcome them as brothers in the struggle against tyranny. They marched with the rhetoric of liberty ringing in their ears. But reality soon revealed itself harsher than any speech. On September 16th, Montgomery's force reached Fort St. John's, a modest yet vital British outpost guarding the approach to Montreal. To advance, the Americans would have to take it. The fort was held by a garrison of 725 British regulars, well-trained, well-armed soldiers who were not inclined to surrender easily. What Montgomery expected to be a swift engagement stretched into a grueling siege. Days turned to weeks as his men dug trenches, exchanged fire, and endured the slow grind of war. Supplies dwindled, disease crept into the camp, rain turned earthworks into mud-soaking clothes, and black powder alike. The Americans, unused to such drawn-out warfare, grew restless. Letters written home during those weeks speak of hunger sickness and the gnawing fear that winter would trap them in the wilderness before victory could be claimed. Montgomery tried to hold morale together. He walked the line, speaking with his men, urging them to remember the greater cause. His leadership, calm yet determined, became the glue that kept the army from unraveling. Slowly, the siege began to tighten around Fort St. John's. British supplies ran short. Their relief efforts faltered. Carleton, stretched thin and unsure of his French-Canadian subjects' loyalty, could not muster the strength to break the siege. Finally, on November 2nd, after nearly 7 weeks of resistance, the fort capitulated. The British garrison surrendered, handing Montgomery a long-awaited victory. It was a hard-fought triumph, and its significance was immense. With St. John's in American hands, nothing stood between Montgomery and Montreal. The march resumed, this time with a sense of momentum. News of the fort's fall spread quickly, shaking Loyalist confidence. French Canadians, though not openly joining the Americans, grew more hesitant to support the British. When Montgomery reached Montreal in mid-November, he found a city unprepared for defense. Using the same strategy he had employed at St. John's, he maneuvered to surround the settlement, threatening from multiple directions. Inside the walls, panic spread. Carleton himself commanded the garrison, but he knew the truth. His position was untenable. Outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and without reinforcements, he could not hope to hold Montreal. In desperation, he attempted escape. Slipping away by boat along the St. Lawrence, he narrowly avoided capture rowing through icy waters, while American patrols scoured the riverbanks. He left the city behind a prize too large to defend with the scraps of his army. On November 13th, Montreal fell. The Americans entered the city not as conquerors, but as weary soldiers who had endured far more than they had expected. Bells tolled, doors creaked open, and French-Canadian inhabitants watched with cautious eyes. Some offered food, others mere silence. Few declared outright allegiance, but fewer still resisted. For Montgomery, it was enough. Montreal was his. The fall of Montreal electrified the colonies. Newspapers carried the news southward, proclaiming victory in bold type. For a brief moment, it seemed the dream of Canada might be realized. Congress celebrated, soldiers cheered, and the revolution tasted the intoxicating sweetness of expansion. Yet Montgomery, pragmatic as ever, knew this was only the beginning. Quebec still loomed, its stone walls and loyal defenders waiting. Montreal was a stepping stone, not the destination. And here lay the great irony. For all the triumph of Montreal, Montgomery's army remained desperately small. 1,700 men had begun the march, but disease, desertion, and exhaustion had whittled their numbers. Supplies remained thin, morale fragile. Worse still, enlistments were due to expire soon. Soldiers who had signed up for a brief campaign were eager to return home before the snows made travel impossible. Montgomery could not hold Montreal indefinitely with such a fragile force. If the revolution was to seize Quebec, he would need more men, and soon. Fortunately, he was not alone in this endeavor. Even as Montreal fell, another column was struggling northward through the wilderness. Benedict Arnold and his battered band fighting not against redcoats, but against the merciless grip of the Canadian wilderness. Their march, far more harrowing than Montgomery's, would bring them to the gates of Quebec, where destiny waited in the shadow of ancient walls. Montgomery's gamble had paid off for now. With 1,700 men, he had carved a path into Canada and seized one of its greatest cities. But the true test lay ahead, in a place where the Revolution's boldest hopes would meet Britain's sturdiest defenses, and where the line between glory and disaster would be measured in blood and snow. The fate of Montreal was not decided in its streets, nor even in the chambers of its governor's residence. It was decided weeks earlier in the marshes and fields surrounding a stubborn British outpost called Fort St. John's. Situated along the Richelieu River, this small but vital fortress blocked the American approach to Montreal. Whoever held it held the gateway to the city. For Richard Montgomery and his 1,700 men, its capture was not optional, it was essential. On September 16, 1775, Montgomery's army arrived before its walls. The fort's defenders numbered 725, a mix of seasoned British redcoats and Loyalist auxiliaries. Though small, the garrison was disciplined, well-armed, and commanded by officers who knew the value of every day they could hold out. For them, every sunrise meant one more chance for reinforcements to arrive, one more chance for Guy Carleton to rally defenses farther north. For Montgomery, every day meant dwindling supplies, more sickness in camp, and restless soldiers whose enlistments ticked steadily toward expiration. The first exchanges of fire crackled across the riverbank's musket balls whipping through the autumn air, but it quickly became clear this would not be a swift affair. Fort St. John's was built for endurance. Its earthworks absorbed cannon fire, its walls resisted musketry, and its defenders dug in with determination. Montgomery realized he faced not a skirmish, but a siege. So began a grueling campaign of trenches, saps, and artillery placements. His men, untrained in European-style siegecraft, labored day and night to cut approaches through mud and brush, inching closer to the fort. Rain lashed the earthworks, turning them into sucking mire. Tents sagged under the weight of water. Powder grew damp muskets unreliable. Disease crept silently through the camp. Fevers, dysentery, and infections claimed as many men as British bullets. The Americans had entered Canada expecting to be liberators. Instead, they found themselves bogged down, starving and shivering in makeshift shelters. Their supply lines stretched painfully thin. Provisions were slow to arrive across Lake Champlain. Bread grew scarce. Meat, when it came, was often rotten. Soldiers boiled their leather shoes to soften them into something vaguely edible. Letters home from the siege speak of hunger gnawing at bellies, of frost settling into bones, and of prayers whispered for deliverance. Yet amid the misery, Montgomery emerged as the linchpin of resolve. Unlike many officers of his era, he shared the hardships of his men. He walked among the trenches, encouraging the weary, binding wounds, listening to complaints with patience. His presence steadied morale when spirits threatened to break. "He bears his sufferings with us," one soldier wrote, "and so we bear ours with him." Inside the fort, the defenders fared little better. Cut off from relief, they watched their supplies dwindle. Gunpowder barrels ran low. Food stores thinned. Still, they clung to their ramparts, determined to deny the Americans easy passage. Every volley they fired bought time for Carleton to prepare defenses farther north. Weeks passed. September bled into October. The Canadian autumn grew colder, the days shorter. Leaves fell from the trees, carpeting the muddy fields with brittle reminders of the winter to come. And still, Fort St. John's held out. At last, reinforcements did arrive, but not for the British. On October 18th, a detachment of Patriot forces captured Fort Chambly, a smaller outpost further downriver. This victory was not only a tactical gain, but a logistical salvation. From Chambly came desperately needed supplies, powder cannon, and food. With these, Montgomery tightened his grip around St. John's. The noose drew closer. The siege became a contest of endurance. American trenches snaked nearer the walls, their guns pounding ceaselessly. Inside the fort, starvation and despair took hold. Carleton and Montreal attempted to raise militia forces to relieve the garrison, but the response was lukewarm at best. The French Canadians, skeptical of both sides, offered little more than guarded neutrality. Carleton's pleas went largely unanswered. By late October, it was clear the British defenders could not hold indefinitely. Their powder was nearly spent. Their men were exhausted, many sick, all hungry. They had fought valiantly, but the weight of circumstances pressed too heavily. On November 2nd, after 47 grueling days, the garrison capitulated. Flags were lowered, muskets stacked, and weary soldiers filed out under terms of surrender. Montgomery's men, equally gaunt and haggard, watched as their adversaries marched away, not with shame, but with the grim dignity of men who had resisted until resistance was no longer possible. The fall of Fort St. John's was more than a tactical victory. It was a turning point. With the Richelieu corridor now open, the road to Montreal lay exposed. The British had lost their shield and Carleton's position grew desperate. The American army, ragged though it was, had pried open the door to Canada. Celebration rippled through Montgomery's camp, but it was muted by exhaustion. They had paid dearly for their triumph. Dozens of comrades lay buried in shallow graves. Hundreds more were weakened by illness and hunger. Supplies, though replenished by Chambly's stores, remained precarious. And winter loomed just beyond the horizon, its icy grip promising to magnify every hardship. Still, the psychological impact was immense. For weeks, the men had wondered if they could endure, if their cause could withstand the strain. Now with the fort in their hands, they believed again. The revolution, so fragile in its first year, had proven it could reach beyond its borders, that even the king's fortresses were not impregnable. Montgomery, ever practical, wasted little time basking in victory. He knew momentum was everything. To pause too long would invite disaster. Carleton was still free, still gathering what forces he could. Reinforcements from Britain could arrive in the spring. The Americans had to press their advantage while it remained. So scarcely had the smoke cleared from St. John's before Montgomery set his sights on the next prize, Montreal itself. His weary army, their boots torn and their bodies weakened, shouldered their packs once more. Driven by the conviction that history was being made with every mile they marched north along the Richelieu, their banners lifted against gray November skies. For Carleton, the loss of St. John's was a bitter blow. He had gambled on French-Canadian loyalty and it had failed him. He had relied on fortresses to stall the invaders, and they had fallen. Now with Montreal exposed, he faced a terrible choice fight, a hopeless battle, or abandon the city and preserve what forces he could for Quebec. The decision would haunt him, and the drama of it would shape the next act of the campaign. Thus ended the siege of Fort St. John's, a brutal, drawn-out struggle that tested endurance, revealed the frailty of British defenses in Canada, and opened the path to one of the Revolution's most daring gambits. The Americans had won, but their greatest challenges still lay ahead. When Fort St. John's finally lowered its flag on November 2, 1775, the fate of Montreal was already sealed. The fortress had been the lock on the Richelieu River. With it broken, the Americans marched unopposed through the corridor that led directly to the heart of New France's old capital. Richard Montgomery wasted no time. He understood momentum. He knew that hesitation could allow Carleton to regroup or reinforcements to arrive. So he pushed his weary soldiers onward, their boots sucking through mud, their breath misting in the chill of early November. The men were tired, their bodies worn thin by weeks of siege and privation, but victory carried them forward like a wind at their backs. Montreal itself was no fortress. Unlike Quebec, which perched upon cliffs and hid behind ancient stone walls, Montreal lay exposed on its island in the St. Lawrence. Its defenses were modest at best, its garrison thin. Carleton, trapped between his duty and his reality, faced an impossible decision. To stand in Montreal was to risk annihilation. To abandon it was to cede Britain's grip on Canada's second city. Carleton chose survival. Quietly, he began preparations for escape. Supplies were gathered, boats secured, plans whispered among trusted aides. He knew he could not hold Montreal against Montgomery's determined army. Better to retreat, preserve his men, and make a stand at Quebec, the bastion that had repelled enemies before and might yet again. For Montgomery, the advance felt almost surreal. He had braced himself for another protracted struggle, another siege of trenches and frost-bitten nights. Instead, as he drew nearer, resistance melted away. Loyalist families whispered of departure. Merchants shuttered shops, uncertain whether to declare for king or Congress. French-Canadian inhabitants watched warily, unwilling to risk their lives for either cause. The city seemed to hold its breath, suspended between two worlds. On November 13th, Montgomery's army encircled Montreal. His strategy was clever, and effective detachments landed to the north, cutting escape routes and projecting an image of overwhelming force. Inside, panic spread. Rumors raced through the streets that thousands of Americans surrounded them, that the city was already lost. Carleton, cloaked in the darkness of night, boarded a small vessel and slipped down the St. Lawrence, narrowly avoiding capture. In one account, American patrols nearly intercepted him, their lanterns glinting on the river's icy waters as his boat hugged the shadows. Only chance, or perhaps providence, allowed him to escape. When dawn broke, the citizens of Montreal awoke to a city leaderless and defenseless. There would be no last stand, no battle in the streets. By afternoon, Montgomery's men marched in their banners, unfurled muskets at their shoulders. Bells tolled uncertainly, signaling neither triumph nor surrender, but a strange in-between. For the inhabitants, it was a change of masters, not of destiny. Montgomery entered Montreal not as a conqueror dripping with pomp, but as a weary soldier mindful of his tenuous position. His men, ragged and hungry, were more concerned with food and shelter than glory. yet there was no mistaking the significance. The second largest city in Canada, a vital hub of trade and administration, had fallen into American hands without a shot fired. The reaction south of the border was electric. News of Montreal's capture raced along the post roads to New York, Philadelphia, and beyond. Pamphlets proclaimed victory, and for a brief moment the revolution seemed unstoppable. Had not a ragged army of volunteers marched into Canada and seized one of Britain's cities? If Montreal could fall so easily, why not Quebec? Why not all of Canada? The dream of a 14th colony united in rebellion seemed almost within grasp. But beneath the celebrations lay more sobering realities. Montgomery knew his army was in no condition to hold a sprawling city indefinitely. Supplies were still scarce, enlistments still expiring. The French-Canadian population, though outwardly calm, offered little in the way of allegiance. They watched, waited, and kept their loyalties close to their chests. Many were Catholic peasants whose bishops urged obedience to the crown. Others simply wished to survive another winter without choosing sides in a foreign rebellion. Montgomery did his best to maintain order. He prohibited looting, sought to reassure the populace, and issued proclamations promising liberty and fair treatment. His discipline impressed even some skeptics, but the deeper question remained, would the habitants ever join the American cause? For the moment, their silence suggested the answer. Meanwhile, Carleton pressed on toward Quebec. His escape, nearly miraculous, preserved not only his life, but also the hope of British Canada. For in Quebec, Carleton knew he could mount a defense. The walled city was the jewel of New France, fortified against centuries of threats. It commanded the river, controlled the gateway to the interior, and stood as a symbol of imperial resilience. If Quebec held, Canada held, and Carleton intended to make sure it did. Thus, Montreal's fall, though dramatic, was not decisive. It was a victory, yes, but a hollow one. A triumph that hinted at greater struggles to come. Montgomery's men warmed themselves in commandeered homes, filled their bellies with whatever provisions they could secure, and looked eastward with both hope and dread. They had taken Montreal, but Quebec awaited, and with it, the true trial of the Canadian campaign. In the weeks that followed, Montgomery began preparing for the march toward Quebec. He gathered what supplies he could, reinforced his lines, and tried to knit together a fragile alliance with the French-Canadian population. But he knew he would need help. His army, reduced in numbers and weary from months of hardship, could not hope to storm Quebec alone. That help was already on its way. Even as Montgomery settled into Montreal, another column of Americans hacked and stumbled through the wilderness of Maine, led by the restless ambition of Benedict Arnold. Their march would be remembered as one of the most grueling in the annals of the Revolution, a test of endurance that pushed men to the brink of death. By the time they emerged from the forests, frost-bitten and starving, they would be half the number that had begun. But they carried with them a determination equal to Montgomery's own. When the two forces met, the dream of Canada would rise to its peak. Montreal had fallen without a fight, but Quebec would demand everything. While Richard Montgomery savored his improbable triumph at Montreal, another drama unfolded hundreds of miles to the east. Benedict Arnold, fiery, restless, and ambitious, had been given a parallel mission by George Washington himself. In September 1775, Arnold was tasked with leading a second column northward through the wilderness of Maine to strike at Quebec. Washington, cautious yet hopeful, knew Montgomery's modest army could not subdue Canada alone. If Arnold could carve a path through the forests, the two forces might converge and deliver a crushing blow before Britain could respond. On paper, it was daring but achievable. On the ground, it was madness. Arnold's route was drawn from maps that were not just inaccurate, they were disastrously misleading. The distance was underestimated by nearly half, rivers misrepresented, mountains ignored. What appeared in Philadelphia as a bold march would, in the Maine wilderness, become a nightmare of mud, snow, and starvation. Arnold assembled 100 men for the expedition. They were volunteers, many drawn from New England regiments eager for adventure. Spirits were high as they set out in late September, their canoes laden with supplies, their muskets gleaming in the autumn sun. They imagined a swift passage northward, a heroic arrival at Quebec, and the laurels of conquest awaiting them. Few could imagine the ordeal that lay ahead. The first weeks were difficult but bearable. The rivers ran swift, forcing men to portage heavy boats over rocky ground. Supplies were lost in rapids. The air grew colder, yet morale remained high. They were pioneers on a grand adventure carrying the revolution into uncharted lands. Arnold himself rode among them with unflagging energy, his presence inspiring confidence. But as October deepened, the expedition crossed a threshold from hardship into disaster. The rivers became a gauntlet. Canoes capsized in violent currents, barrels of flour and powder sinking beneath the waves. Men slipped on wet rocks, breaking limbs or drowning under the weight of gear. Portages stretched for miles. Soldiers bent double under burdens heavier than their bodies could endure. Rain lashed down, turning every trail into a quagmire. Supplies dwindled faster than expected. The inaccurate maps had misled them into believing the journey would take weeks. It stretched into months. Rations were halved, then halved again. By mid-October, hunger gnawed at every belly. Men boiled their moccasins into broth, chewed on leather straps, and scoured the forest floor for roots and bark. Some fell behind, too weak to continue. Their bodies later found where they had collapsed. Others deserted, stumbling southward in hopes of survival. The wilderness itself became an enemy. Early snowstorms swept through, coating the ground in white, freezing hands to musket barrels. Frostbite blackened toes and fingers. Wolves howled in the distance, drawn by the smell of death. One diary records the desperate cry of a starving man, "God, deliver us from this place, for it is hell upon earth." Arnold, ever relentless, pushed forward. He refused to abandon the mission, even as his numbers shrank. He trudged through swamps, waded rivers up to his chest, and shared the meager rations of his men. His determination was iron, his pride unbending. He knew that to turn back would mean failure, disgrace, and the collapse of the Canadian expedition before it even reached Quebec. He pressed on, demanding the same of his men. By early November, the expedition was a shadow of what it had been. Of the 100 who had begun, barely 600 remained. The rest had deserted, died, or been left behind. Gaunt, hollow-eyed soldiers staggered through the snow, their uniforms in tatters, muskets rusted from rain. When at last they emerged from the wilderness and reached the outskirts of Quebec on November 9th, it was not as an army, but as survivors of an ordeal. Their condition shocked even themselves. Many were barefoot, their feet wrapped in rags. Others leaned on makeshift crutches, too weak to carry muskets. They had no cannon, no horses, little powder. Their provisions were nearly gone. And yet somehow they had arrived. They had done what few thought possible, carved a path through hundreds of miles of hostile wilderness, and emerged ragged but unbroken at the gates of Quebec. The city that rose before them was magnificent and forbidding. Perched on cliffs above the St. Lawrence, Quebec's walls and bastions loomed like stone giants. Towers and steeples pierced the sky, a reminder of its centuries-old history as the heart of New France. For the half-starved Americans, it was both a vision of triumph and a nightmare. Inside those walls waited a well-supplied garrison of 1,800 British regulars and loyal militia. The defenders were strong, the city impregnable to an army that had left its artillery buried in the rapids of Maine. Arnold, characteristically undaunted, set up camp outside the city and demanded surrender. He hoped that the French Canadians within might rise to his cause, or that the mere audacity of his arrival would shake British resolve. Carleton, now firmly ensconced in Quebec, refused to be cowed. He dismissed Arnold's summons with contempt, confident that the ragged figures outside posed no real threat. For nearly 3 weeks, Arnold lingered outside Quebec, his men enduring bitter winds and icy nights. They built fires from stolen wood, patched clothing with scraps, and clung to life as snow deepened. Still, Arnold held them together with promises Montgomery was coming. Reinforcements would soon arrive from Montreal. Together, they would make Quebec tremble. And indeed, salvation was on the way. On December 2nd, Montgomery marched into camp with 300 fresh soldiers' supplies and, crucially, artillery. His arrival transformed despair into hope. Cheers rang through the frost-bitten encampment as the two columns forged in hardship finally joined forces. For the first time, the Americans stood before Quebec with a united army. But numbers alone did not change reality. Together, Montgomery and Arnold commanded fewer than 1,000 effective men. They faced nearly twice that number behind Quebec's walls, well-fed, well-armed, and shielded by stone ramparts impervious to American cannon. Worse still, the enlistments of many soldiers would expire at the end of December. Time, once again, was slipping away. The harrowing march had delivered Arnold's men to Quebec, but at a terrible price. They were weakened, undersupplied, and pitted against impossible odds. Yet the fusion of Montgomery's pragmatism and Arnold's recklessness created a volatile determination. If Quebec could be taken swiftly, the revolution might still seize Canada. If not, the dream would die in the snow. As December deepened and the river froze, the Americans prepared for one final gamble and assault on the fortress city itself. They had endured hunger, disease storms, and wilderness. Now they would test themselves against stone steel and the relentless will of Carleton. The wilderness had nearly destroyed them. Quebec might finish what the forests had begun. On December 2nd, 1775, Richard Montgomery finally marched his weary men eastward from Montreal and into the frozen camps outside Quebec. The ragged survivors of Benedict Arnold's harrowing wilderness trek greeted him with a mixture of relief and awe. They had endured starvation and frostbite, yet held on, clinging to the hope that Montgomery would bring salvation. And now, at last, he had arrived with food, with munitions, with reinforcements, and with the authority of command. The meeting of the two forces was a moment of triumph, if only briefly. Arnold's gaunt soldiers, their uniforms little more than rags, cheered as Montgomery's column approached. Montgomery himself, though exhausted from weeks of campaigning, carried the aura of victory. He had taken Montreal with minimal bloodshed, seized Fort St. John's through perseverance, and now joined forces with Arnold before the most coveted target of all. Together, they commanded an army that, while small, possessed the kind of daring ambition that could change history. Yet as the first cheers faded into the cold air, the stark reality of their situation became painfully clear. Quebec was no Montreal. Quebec was a fortress. The city rose majestically from the cliffs of the St. Lawrence, its stone walls and bastions centuries in the making. It had repelled sieges before, most famously during the 7 Years' War, when General James Wolfe scaled its heights in 1759. The Americans, numbering fewer than 1,000 effective troops, now faced 1,800 defenders behind those walls. Carleton had made full use of his time. Since slipping away from Montreal, he had rallied loyalists, reorganized militia, and prepared the city for a prolonged defense. Powder stores were stocked, artillery, positioned food secured. For the first time since the invasion began, Britain held the advantage. Montgomery wasted no time testing the defenses. His newly arrived artillery was dragged into position and trained on Quebec's walls. Yet when the guns fired, the truth became undeniable. They were too small, too light, too few. The stone ramparts shook but did not break. Cannonballs bounced harmlessly or embedded themselves without doing real damage. The defenders jeered from above, confident in their security. Worse still, nature conspired against the attackers. The ground was frozen solid, covered in sheets of ice. Digging trenches or building earthworks, the traditional tools of siege warfare, proved nearly impossible. Shovels struck rock-hard ground that refused to yield. The Americans, already ill-supplied, had no means to improvise. Winter pressed in from all sides, an enemy as cruel as any British musket. The soldiers felt the strain immediately. Montgomery's reinforcements had brought food, but it was meager and would not last long. Shelters were hastily built from wood and canvas, but they offered little protection against the bitter winds sweeping down the river. Frostbite gnawed at fingers and toes. Campfires burned constantly, consuming precious wood, yet never seemed to dispel the cold. Sickness spread, carried on damp air and weakened bodies. Inside Quebec, by contrast, spirits rose. Carleton, calm and calculating, understood that time was his ally. The longer the Americans lingered, the weaker they would grow. He refused to be drawn into rash action. He issued orders, drilled his men, and fortified the city's weak points. He even encouraged theatrical displays of confidence, patrols walking boldly along the walls, cannon firing intermittently to remind the besiegers of the strength they faced. For every American cheer of defiance, the defenders answered with a roar of loyalist confidence. As December advanced, Montgomery realized he faced a dilemma as cruel as it was simple. He could not wait indefinitely. Most of his soldiers' enlistments would expire on New Year's Day. In less than a month, the bulk of his army might simply march home, leaving him powerless before Quebec's walls. To retreat would mean humiliation and the death of the dream of Canada. To stay without action would mean slow disintegration. Only one path remained. He would have to storm the city. It was a gamble of desperation. Quebec's walls were strong, its defenders numerous, its approaches treacherous. Yet Montgomery believed surprise and courage might succeed where artillery and time could not. His men, though exhausted, still burned with revolutionary zeal. They had endured too much to walk away now. And so, as snowstorms rolled across the St. Lawrence and winds howled through the camp, Montgomery began to plan what he knew would be a final decisive assault. The first attempt came on December 27th. A snowstorm swept in, cloaking the city in swirling white. Under its cover, Montgomery prepared to launch his men forward, but fate, fickle as ever, intervened. The clouds parted, the moon broke through, and silver light spilled across the field. Suddenly, the American positions were exposed, their movement betrayed. Carleton's sentries spotted them, and the element of surprise vanished. Montgomery, cursing his misfortune, called off the attack. It was a bitter blow. The men returned to their shelters, morale sinking lower. Time continued to tick away. In just days, hundreds would be free to leave their enlistments fulfilled. The dream of taking Quebec seemed to be slipping through Montgomery's fingers like snow through open hands. Then came another cruel twist. Among Montgomery's ranks, a sergeant deserted. Slipping across the lines, he betrayed the American plans to Carleton, revealing strategies, weaknesses, and intentions. The British governor, ever cautious, now possessed the advantage of foresight. He knew where the Americans intended to strike, and he adjusted his defenses accordingly. Still, Montgomery refused to yield. He reworked the plan, crafting a daring maneuver. Instead of battering futilely at the walls, the Americans would launch a pincer movement. Two columns led by Montgomery and Arnold would attack the city's lower quarters from opposite sides. Diversionary forces would strike elsewhere, keeping the defenders stretched and uncertain. It was audacious, risky, and perhaps suicidal, but it was the only option left. The men listened as their officers explained the plan. Some nodded grimly, others muttered doubts, but few dared openly protest. They had not come so far, endured so much to retreat without a fight. If Quebec could be taken, if the revolution could be extended into Canada, it might change the course of the war itself. Hope, fragile though it was, burned still. The stage was set. The armies waited. The river lay frozen, the air sharp with the scent of snow. And then, on the night of December 30th, as a blizzard swept in and darkness cloaked the city, Montgomery gave the order. At 2 in the morning, the Americans began to move their footsteps, muffled in the snow, their breaths steaming in the frigid air. Ahead lay Quebec, ancient and defiant, its cannon silent for now, its walls looming through the storm. For Montgomery, for Arnold, for the hundreds of men who followed them, this was the moment of reckoning. The dream of Canada would live or die before dawn. The blizzard that swept across Quebec in late December 1775 was more than a storm, it was a harbinger. For the Americans camped outside the walls, it signaled both doom and possibility. The snow, driven by furious winds, blinded eyes, and smothered sound, turning the world white and silent. In such conditions, a determined army might move unseen, slipping past cannon muzzles and watchful sentries. Yet for those same soldiers, the storm also froze flesh to steel and filled lungs with knives of ice. Nature was no neutral backdrop in this campaign. It was a full participant, and it seemed determined to punish anyone who dared invade Canada. Richard Montgomery felt the pressure like a weight upon his chest. Since his arrival at Quebec, he had watched the days tick away with ruthless regularity. Every sunrise brought him closer to the end of December, closer to the moment when the contracts binding his soldiers to this campaign would expire. These were volunteers, farmers, and artisans, not professional soldiers. When their enlistments ended, many would lay down their arms and walk home, no matter how desperate the cause. Already campfires flickered with muttered conversations of men who dreamed of hearths and families rather than frozen ramparts. Montgomery knew the truth. If he did not act before the calendar turned, his army would dissolve beneath him. He could not hold his ground indefinitely, nor could he retreat without shame. To march away from Quebec would mean the end of the Canadian dream, the collapse of American prestige, and perhaps the emboldening of Britain across the colonies. To stay without attacking was to invite disintegration by inertia. And so the general's choices narrowed to one: he must strike, and strike now before time and nature destroyed him without a shot fired. The cannons had already failed him. When first set up in December, they had been his great hope. Perhaps he thought the heavy guns would batter Quebec's walls into submission, forcing Carleton to surrender. But when the cannonballs thudded harmlessly against ancient stone, bouncing like pebbles against a cliff, that hope crumbled. The Americans had no siege train, no massive artillery capable of reducing bastions centuries old. Their light field pieces made noise, but no progress. Worse still, the ground itself betrayed them. Frozen earth covered in sheets of ice refused the shovel. Trenches, the lifeblood of a siege, could not be dug. Defensive structures crumbled in the frost. The Americans were forced to squat in shallow holes or crude huts exposed to the wind. Some soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets stiff with ice, their bodies trembling through the long nights. Sentries collapsed from exhaustion, their muskets slipping from frozen fingers. The wind howled through every gap, carrying with it the bitter certainty that winter was the true master of this battlefield. In these conditions, desperation became a constant companion. Food was short. Meat, when found, was stringy and frozen. Bread turned rock hard in the cold. Rum rations were treasured as liquid fire swallowed in gulps that briefly banished the chill. Sickness spread: dysentery, scurvy, fevers that burned men out from the inside while the world outside froze them solid. Death came silently in the night. Soldiers found stiff and pale at dawn, their faces frozen masks of exhaustion. And yet, even in such misery, the Americans clung to a fragile thread of hope. They were not alone. Benedict Arnold's men, survivors of the wilderness ordeal, had already endured worse. Their very presence outside Quebec was a testament to human endurance. If they could survive that march, perhaps they could storm these walls. Montgomery, too, was a source of inspiration. Calm, composed, never asking of his soldiers what he would not do himself, he walked among them, steadying morale with quiet words and steady eyes. Across the walls, however, the defenders grew more confident. Guy Carleton had learned of the American struggles. He knew their supplies were meager, their numbers few, their contracts fleeting. The deserters' revelations had only confirmed what he already suspected: time was on his side. He ordered his men to keep watch, to fire occasionally to remind the Americans of their presence. But he would not be lured into open battle. Why risk what winter and patience would win for him? The stalemate was unbearable. For Montgomery, each passing day was like sand slipping through a clenched fist. He knew he must gamble everything on a sudden blow, a strike that would bypass walls and smash into the heart of the city itself. The plan he devised was bold, bordering on reckless, but it was the only hope left. The assault would come under cover of a storm when visibility was low and watchfulness relaxed. The Americans would divide into 4 groups. 2 diversionary forces would launch attacks against the upper town, drawing the defenders' attention and cannon fire. Meanwhile, Montgomery and Arnold would lead the main columns into the lower town, striking at the weaker gates and pushing inward to converge at the heart of Quebec. It was a pincer movement relying on coordination, courage, and above all, the chaos of snow and darkness. The men were told of the plan in hushed tones. Some received it with grim nods, others with wide eyes. They knew what it meant. A storming of a fortified city was among the bloodiest acts in war. But few dared voice dissent. They had not come this far through swamps and snow only to slink away. If Quebec fell, they might yet claim Canada for the Revolution. If not, well, better to die in glory than freeze in despair. On the night of December 27th, the plan was first attempted. The storm seemed favorable, snow whipping across the fields, blanketing the world in white silence. Men moved into position, clutching muskets close, stepping carefully across ice. Then cruelly, the skies cleared. The moon, bright and pitiless, spilled silver light across the landscape. Suddenly, the hidden columns were revealed, their outlines stark against the snow. Carleton's sentries saw everything. Muskets, cracked alarms rang out. Montgomery had no choice but to call off the attack. The men stumbled back to camp, bitter and exhausted. The chance had slipped through their fingers, and time had nearly run out. Only 4 days remained before many enlistments expired. 4 days before men who had suffered so much would simply pack their meager belongings and march away, their duty fulfilled. Montgomery could feel history narrowing around him, pressing him into one last desperate decision. He reworked the plan, knowing it would be his final attempt. As if in answer, the weather shifted once more. On the night of December 30th, a furious blizzard swept across Quebec. Snow fell in sheets, winds howled through alleys and over ramparts. Visibility dropped to nothing. It was the cover Montgomery had prayed for, now or never. At 2 in the morning, the Americans stirred. Orders whispered down the lines. Muskets were loaded powder horns, checked scarves pulled tight against the biting cold. Men kissed medallions, murmured prayers, or pressed tokens of loved ones against their lips. Then into the storm they moved. Montgomery led his column southward, hugging the banks of the St. Lawrence, while Arnold advanced from the north. 2 great claws closing in on the city, their movements hidden by the fury of snow. It was a moment suspended between desperation and destiny. The Revolution's hopes for Canada now rested on 1,000 weary men stumbling through darkness and storm toward the strongest fortress in North America. The blizzard of December 30th, 1775, was both ally and enemy. Snow whipped through the air in furious gusts, cloaking the city, muffling footsteps, and turning every lantern into a weak blur of light. For Montgomery, it was the cover he had been waiting for. For Arnold, it was a curtain behind which he hoped to smuggle his half-starved men into glory. But behind Quebec's walls, Governor Guy Carleton was not blind. The betrayal of an American sergeant who deserted days earlier had already given Carleton a chilling advantage. This man, weary of cold and convinced of defeat, had slipped away to the British lines and revealed the outlines of Montgomery's plan. He described the dual assaults, the diversions, even the weakness of the Americans' powder stores. Armed with this knowledge, Carleton adjusted his defenses, shifting men to vulnerable points and preparing traps where he suspected the invaders would strike. And so the stage was set, one side blinded by snow and desperation, the other forewarned and waiting. Montgomery led his column south along the banks of the St. Lawrence. The river, frozen in places, loomed black in the storm's shifting light. Icicles clung to beards, muskets gathered, frost boots crunched on ice. Montgomery's men trudged forward, teeth chattering their forms, little more than shadows in the storm. Yet the general himself radiated calm resolve. He had chosen to march at the head of his men to share their peril, to be not only their commander, but their comrade in arms. His courage steadied them as they advanced toward a small British redoubt on the edge of the lower town. Arnold, meanwhile, led his battered veterans along a northern approach toward the palace gate. These were the men who had hacked their way through Maine's wilderness, who had eaten boiled leather and marched barefoot across frozen ground. Their gaunt faces now gleamed with snow, their eyes fierce, despite the hunger gnawing in their bellies. They carried no cannon, only muskets and determination, but Arnold's fire kept them moving. Even wounded from weeks of hardship, he limped among them, rallying their spirits with promises of glory and revenge. Between them, 2 diversionary forces crept toward the upper town, tasked with distracting the defenders. Their role was to create noise and confusion, to hammer the gates and walls so that Carleton's garrison would not know where the real danger lay. Yet in the blizzard, confusion was already everywhere. Signals blurred, orders grew muddled, men stumbled in the dark. What was meant to be coordination became instead chaos. Inside Quebec, the defenders strained their eyes against the storm. The walls, ancient and familiar, were now treacherous with ice. Cannon crews stood ready, fuses dry beneath tarps, their breath steaming as they waited for the alarm. Militiamen peered into the whiteness, unsure whether the figures moving below were real or imagined. Carleton himself remained calm, moving from bastion to bastion, ensuring that every position was manned, every weak point reinforced. He knew the Americans must strike that night. Their desperation was too great, their time too short. The battle began suddenly, violently. Montgomery, leading from the front, guided 17 men toward what he believed to be an undefended barricade. The storm howled around them, snow stinging eyes and skin. The general's cloak whipped behind him, his voice carried faintly over the roar of wind. His men, emboldened by his presence, lowered their shoulders and rushed forward. But the deserters' warning had not been in vain. The redoubt was no hollow shell. It was one of Carleton's most heavily fortified positions. As Montgomery's column broke into the open, a sudden eruption of light and sound split the night. Cannon belched flame, muskets cracked, grape shot ripped through the storm. In an instant, Montgomery was struck down, killed where he stood. The iron balls tore through him with merciless precision, felling the leader who had carried the revolution's hopes into Canada. The men around him reeled in horror. Some fell dead beside him, others turned and fled into the white fury, their courage broken by the sudden violence. In the blizzard, the scene dissolved into chaos. A general gone, a column shattered, the southward assault in ruins. Arnold did not yet know of Montgomery's fate. He pressed his men forward at the northern gate, urging them through narrow streets that twisted like frozen veins. They slipped past an artillery outpost, their boots crunching on icy cobblestones, their muskets clenched in frost-bitten hands. For a moment, it seemed they might succeed. They reached the palace gate, pressed into the lower town, and scrambled for cover as defenders fired from above. But then came disaster again. Arnold, true to his reckless nature, exposed himself at the head of the column, shouting for his men to charge. A musket ball tore into his leg, dropping him instantly. Writhing in agony, he was carried to the rear, furious but helpless. Command fell to Captain Daniel Morgan, a man as bold as he was practical. Morgan rallied the troops, shouting through the storm, his voice cutting through musket fire. He led a charge against British barricades, his sword flashing, his presence steady. For a brief, shining moment, the Americans tasted success. They captured a British captain, and his men pressed forward into the lower town and opened the way deeper into Quebec. The city seemed vulnerable, the defenders momentarily shaken. Yet hesitation poisoned victory. Morgan, cautious of overextension, paused to consult with his officers. They had taken prisoners, they argued. To press further might risk being cut off. Better to wait for Montgomery to join forces before striking deeper. Morgan, against his instincts, agreed. And so the Americans lingered in the snow-choked streets, waiting for a man who would never come. Carleton seized the moment. Using the pause, he repositioned his defenders, flooding men into the threatened sector. Muskets and cannon were turned on the trapped Americans, fire pouring down from the walls and rooftops. Soon the hunters became the hunted. As dawn crept pale and gray across the city, the battle turned inexorably against the invaders. Morgan's men found themselves hemmed in their escape, cut off, bullets hissing from every angle. Blood streaked the snow. Wounded men groaned where they fell, their breath freezing in the air. Morgan fought fiercely, but by mid-morning he was surrounded. With no path forward and none back, he had no choice. At 9 o'clock, sword in hand, he surrendered along with some 430 men. The pincer movement, so bold in conception, had collapsed in execution. Montgomery lay dead in the snow, Arnold wounded, and carried away Morgan a prisoner of war. Of the American force, 60 were dead, 34 wounded, and hundreds captured. The British, by contrast, lost just 5 men killed and 13 wounded. It was a catastrophe, a brutal reminder of how fragile the revolution remained. For Carleton, the victory was absolute. He had defended Quebec against all odds, preserved Canada for the crown, and shattered the American dream of a 14th colony. For the Revolution, it was a bitter defeat. The invincible momentum that had carried them from Ticonderoga to Montreal now lay broken in the snow outside Quebec. And yet, in the bitter aftermath, the Americans refused to vanish entirely. Arnold, though wounded, clung to the remnants of Montgomery's force, holding a tenuous line through the winter. But the dream of Canada had died with Montgomery on that frozen night, revealed not as destiny, but as desperation. The night of December 30th, 1775 fell heavy over Quebec. A storm raged across the frozen city winds, whipping through alleys, snow, swirling in thick curtains that blurred torches and smothered sound. To many in the garrison, it seemed madness that anyone would attempt an attack under such conditions. Yet for Richard Montgomery, it was the opportunity he had prayed for. The storm would be his shield, the blizzard his ally. At 2 in the morning, the Americans stirred from their crude shelters. Men stumbled into the snow scarves, wrapped tight over mouths, muskets hugged close to keep powder dry. The icy wind cut through cloth and flesh alike, but Montgomery's voice carried above it calm and resolute. Forward, he urged, gesturing toward the riverbank. His men, shivering but inspired, obeyed. The column moved south, hugging the St. Lawrence. The river's black surface glistened with shifting ice, the sound of it cracking faintly beneath the howl of wind. Snow lashed into eyes, reduced the world to a haze of white and shadow. It was a march through nightmare, and yet within that nightmare, Montgomery believed he carried surprise. The British would not expect an attack in such weather. For a moment, fortune seemed to favor the desperate. Montgomery's plan was simple: slip along the riverside, seize a small barricade believed to be lightly manned, and push into the lower town. Once inside, momentum would carry them through narrow streets to link with Arnold's column striking from the north. If both forces converged, Quebec might buckle under the sudden weight. It was audacious, dangerous, but it was the only chance left. The men trudged on, 17 of them moving directly with Montgomery at the head. Their boots crunched on snow, their breaths plumed into the air. The blizzard covered their sound, masked their movements. They crept toward the barricade like wraiths in the storm. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the muffled thud of footsteps. Then light, sudden and searing, exploded from the darkness. The barricade was no weak point. It was a fortress in miniature, bristling with cannon and muskets, manned by alert defenders who had been warned by the deserter. As Montgomery's party broke into the open, the British unleashed hell. A cannon roared, belching flame. Grape shot tore through the storm, whistling like banshees. In an instant, the night was filled with screams. Montgomery was struck squarely in the chest. The iron balls ripped through his body, killing him instantly. He fell without a word, his lifeless form crumpling into the snow. Around him, men were torn apart, flung to the ground in twisted shapes. The survivors froze in shock, then broke, stumbling back into the storm, their courage shattered. In a heartbeat, the southern prong of the assault had collapsed. The general who had carried the dream of Canada in his hands now lay face down in the snow, lifeless, his cloak darkening beneath the storm. The blizzard howled on indifferent, but the battle was not over. To the north, Benedict Arnold and his column were still moving. Unaware of Montgomery's fate, Arnold pressed forward through narrow streets, his men half blind in the storm. They crept past a British artillery outpost, luck shielding them as sentries failed to spot their shadows. For a moment, hope flared. They had slipped into the lower town. Success seemed within reach. Arnold himself, reckless as ever, led from the front. He limped through the snow, musket and hand cloak whipping in the wind. Forward he shouted, rallying his men. Then a shot cracked through the blizzard and Arnold collapsed, struck in the leg. Blood poured into the snow as he grimaced in pain, furious more at being halted than at being wounded. His men dragged him to safety, his voice still barking orders even as he was carried away. Command fell to Captain Daniel Morgan, a man of fierce courage and raw determination. Morgan seized the moment. Sword flashing, he urged the men onward, leading them against a British barricade. Musket balls whizzed past him, one grazing his cheek, another piercing his hat. Yet he pressed forward, shouting, charging, and miraculously breaking through. His men followed, bayonets, stabbing, muskets, clubbing. The barricade fell, prisoners taken, and the way forward lay open. For a brief, breathless moment, the Americans stood triumphant. The lower town lay vulnerable. Quebec, the fortress city, seemed suddenly within their grasp. If Morgan pushed forward, if momentum carried them into the heart of the city, history might be rewritten. But hesitation crept in. Morgan's officers urged caution. They had prisoners to guard, they argued. They had already taken losses. To press further without Montgomery's support could mean annihilation. Morgan, though burning with desire to advance, allowed himself to be swayed. He paused, held his men back, and waited. That pause was fatal. Montgomery's column would never arrive. Their commander lay dead in the snow. And while the Americans waited in hesitation, Carleton acted with decisiveness. The governor dispatched reinforcements, rushing men to the threatened quarter. Muskets lined the walls, cannons swiveled rooftops, bristled with defenders. When Morgan finally resumed the attack, he found himself facing an enemy no longer scattered but concentrated, no longer surprised but ready. The blizzard became a killing field. Shots rained down from above, men crumpled in the narrow streets. The snow stained crimson beneath their bodies. Morgan shouted himself hoarse, rallying his troops, but the trap had closed. The Americans were hemmed in their retreat, cut off fire, pouring from every direction. By 9 in the morning, the fight was hopeless. Surrounded, his men dropping all around him. Morgan had no choice. Sword in hand, he surrendered, offering it to the British officers who stepped forward. Around 430 Americans laid down their arms that day, their faces hollow with exhaustion and despair. The storm eased the snow, settling into drifts around the silent forms of the fallen. Montgomery's body lay cold and still, a martyr to ambition. Arnold, wounded, raged at his incapacity. Morgan, captured, endured the humiliation of defeat. And the dream of Canada, bold, reckless, and improbable, collapsed with them in the snow. The cost was staggering. 60 Americans killed, 34 wounded, hundreds captured. By contrast, the British lost only 5 dead, 13 wounded. It was not a battle so much as a slaughter, the blizzard serving not as a cloak of victory, but as a shroud of failure. For the Americans, it was a bitter awakening. Their courage had been real, their sacrifice undeniable. But courage could not overcome stone walls, entrenched defenders, and the unyielding fury of winter. The revolution would not spread to Canada, not this year, not under these men. As the day ended, the blizzard passed, the skies cleared, and Quebec stood untouched, its walls gleaming in the pale winter sun. The city had endured, and with it, Britain's hold on the north remained unbroken. History often turns not on the clash of thousands, but on the fate of a single man. For the invasion of Canada in 1775, that man was Richard Montgomery. His life, his leadership, and his sudden death in the snow outside Quebec would decide the course of the entire campaign. Montgomery had been a soldier of the British Empire long before he became a general of the Revolution. Born in Ireland, raised in the traditions of the Crown, he had fought with distinction during the 7 Years' War, earning respect as a capable officer. Yet the very empire he served seemed to deny him advancement, leaving him overlooked and embittered. Marriage to Janet Livingston of the influential New York family tied him to the colonies, and when war erupted in 1775, Montgomery cast his lot with the Patriots. Some whispered that he sought vindication, others that he sought freedom. Perhaps he sought both. What cannot be doubted is the devotion of the men who followed him. At Fort St. John's at Montreal, Montgomery proved himself calm, steady, humane. He was not the kind of commander who barked orders from horseback and vanished into headquarters. He walked among his soldiers, shared their hardships, and listened to their complaints. In an age of aloof generals, Montgomery was a figure of trust. They loved him for it, and it was that love that carried them through weeks of siege and starvation. On the night of December 30th, when he led them through the storm, it was not only strategy, but his presence that compelled obedience. Shivering men, their enlistments nearly expired, marched into the blizzard because Montgomery was at their side. He embodied their hope, their cause, their very reason for enduring. And then, in a flash of grapeshot, he was gone. The British cannon erupted from the barricade, its mouth belching fire into the storm. Grapeshot tore through the night, scattering death in every direction. Montgomery was struck squarely, his chest ripped apart, his body hurled backward into the snow. Accounts vary as to whether he died instantly or gasped a final breath, but all agree that he did not rise again. Around him, several aides and soldiers were cut down, their cries swallowed by the blizzard. The survivors froze in horror. Their general, the man who had led them into Canada, who had carried them through siege and sickness, who had promised them victory, now lay lifeless at their feet. Panic surged. Some dropped their weapons and fled. Others stumbled back through the snow, dragging the wounded, abandoning the assault before it had even begun. Leadership evaporated with Montgomery's fall. In that moment, the revolution lost more than a battle. It lost one of its most promising commanders. George Washington himself would later write that Montgomery's death was a great loss to America. Thomas Jefferson, upon hearing the news, called him the darling of the army. Even Benjamin Franklin, no stranger to disappointment, lamented his passing with rare emotion. To the leaders of the revolution, Montgomery had been a figure of stability, a man whose European training combined with American conviction promised great things. His death left a void that would never be filled. The British, upon recovering his body, treated it with respect. Carleton, though an enemy, recognized Montgomery as a gallant opponent. His remains were buried near Quebec, interred with honors denied to many who perished in that storm. Decades later, in 1818, his body would be returned to New York at the request of his widow Janet. There, amid solemn ceremony, it was laid to rest at St. Paul's Chapel in Manhattan, where visitors can still see the monument erected in his honor. For the men who had followed him, however, the grief was immediate and crushing. They returned to camp broken not only by the storm's fury and the enemy's fire, but by the knowledge that their general had fallen at the very front, leading them with his own hand. Letters home carried the sorrow across the colonies. Our brave General Montgomery is no more. One soldier wrote his words heavy with despair. We are undone. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Armies often endure defeat, but the loss of a beloved commander can sap courage in ways no battlefield statistic can measure. Montgomery's men, already weary and hungry, now faced the winter with sagging spirits. Their commander's death became a symbol of the futility of the campaign. The revolution had reached too far too soon and had been punished by fate. Yet his death also elevated him to martyrdom. Newspapers printed his name in bold type, recounting his sacrifice in near religious tones. He was compared to heroes of antiquity, to martyrs of liberty who gave their lives so that others might be free. His image was reproduced, his story told and retold. In taverns and churches, men raised toasts to Montgomery, swearing his death would not be in vain. In truth, though, the practical effect was devastating. Without Montgomery, the army before Quebec lost coherence. Benedict Arnold, wounded in the leg, tried to maintain control, but he lacked the numbers and supplies to mount another assault. Daniel Morgan, captured with hundreds of men, could offer no further help. What remained of the force, huddled in the snow outside Quebec, clinging to survival but robbed of hope. The revolution would not conquer Canada, not that winter, and perhaps never at all. Montgomery's death was in the end both tragedy and turning point. Tragedy because a man of rare ability and rare humanity was cut down in his prime, leaving his cause weaker for his absence. Turning point because it marked the collapse of the bold but reckless dream of adding Canada to the American Rebellion. The revolution would continue, of course. It would find victories elsewhere on other fields in other years, but the road north had ended in the snow outside Quebec, with Montgomery's lifeless body as its final marker. Even today, the story resonates. The image of a general leading from the front, marching through a blizzard, only to be struck down in an instant, remains vivid. It is a reminder that history's grand visions often hinge on fragile moments, a single volley, a single life. And it is a reminder, too, of the price of ambition, the way noble dreams can be shattered not by lack of courage, but by the cruel indifference of chance. For Montgomery, there was no retreat, no second chance. His legacy was sealed in that instant of grape shot. He became a symbol of bravery, of sacrifice, of what the revolution demanded of those who would carry it forward. For the men who survived him, his death was a wound that winter could not freeze shut, a loss that haunted them long after the snows melted. The blizzard passed. The sun rose over Quebec, gleaming on walls that stood unbroken. Inside the city, Carleton celebrated his improbable victory. Outside, the Americans mourned a general who would never march again. And across the colonies, news spread of a hero fallen, a campaign lost, and a dream deferred. Montgomery's death was not just the end of a man. It was the end of the Revolution's first great gamble, the end of the invasion of Canada. While Richard Montgomery's body lay lifeless in the snow to the south, Benedict Arnold pressed forward from the north, unaware that fate had already struck down his fellow commander. The blizzard howled around him, but Arnold's will burned hotter than the wind was cold. He limped through the storm at the head of his column, his men huddled behind him in the narrow streets leading toward the palace gate. These soldiers were no strangers to misery. They had been forged in the wilderness of Maine, their ranks thinned by starvation and frostbite, their endurance tested beyond the limits of ordinary men. Those who still stood were hardened by suffering, and their eyes burned with a fanatic determination. Quebec's walls loomed before them, but to men who had eaten boiled leather to survive, the city seemed no more impregnable than the forests they had already conquered. Arnold, reckless and unyielding, moved like a man possessed. He barked orders through the wind, urged his men forward, and personally scouted ahead in the blinding snow. This was his nature, to be first in danger, to embody the courage he demanded. His enemies and allies alike had long noted this trait. To some, it was inspiring. To others, it was suicidal. That night, it was both. The Americans advanced silently through the storm, slipping past a British artillery outpost. The defenders, blinded by snow, did not spot them in time. For a moment, Arnold's gamble seemed to be working. They reached the palace gate and pushed into the lower town. The streets twisted ahead like frozen veins, flanked by tall houses whose shutters rattled in the wind. Every corner threatened ambush. Every rooftop might conceal muskets. Then, in the chaos of snow and darkness, the British struck. From hidden positions, Loyalist militia opened fire. Bullets hissed through the storm, smashing into walls, clattering on cobblestones, striking flesh. The Americans scrambled for cover, firing back blindly into the blizzard. Shouts echoed in the narrow alleys, muffled by snow confusion mingling with courage. Arnold did not flinch. He rose from cover, shouting for his men to follow, rallying them for a charge. Musket balls zipped past him, one tearing through his cloak. Then came the shot that changed everything. A ball struck his leg, ripping into muscle, pitching him to the ground. Pain seared through him like fire. But what stung worse was the knowledge that he could no longer lead. Furious, he tried to rise, tried to press forward on one leg, but his men pulled him back. They carried him to safety, his curses mingling with orders. Even in agony, he refused to surrender his will. "Push on," he cried. "Take the barricade." With Arnold incapacitated, command fell to Captain Daniel Morgan, a man whose courage rivaled any in the army. Morgan was a towering figure, broad-shouldered, fearless, his face marked by the hard life of a frontiersman. When the men saw him step forward, sword in hand, they rallied. Morgan did what Arnold would have done. He led from the front. With a shout, he charged at the barricade, musket fire flashing around him. Bullets grazed his cheek, pierced his hat, but he pressed on his sword, cutting through the storm. His men followed, bayonets lowered, crashing into the British position with a fury born of desperation. In brutal hand-to-hand combat, they overwhelmed the defenders, capturing a British captain and scores of prisoners. For a moment, triumph gleamed through the snow. The lower town was open before them. Quebec, the fortress city, seemed suddenly vulnerable. Morgan urged his men forward, momentum carrying them through the streets. The defenders reeled, momentarily stunned by the ferocity of the assault. For the first time, it seemed as if the Americans might succeed, that the Revolution's bold gamble could pay off. But fate intervened again. The captured prisoners became a burden. Some of Morgan's officers, cautious in the chaos, urged him to halt. They argued that advancing deeper into the city with prisoners in tow was too dangerous. They insisted they should hold their ground until Montgomery's column arrived from the south, then strike together. Morgan, though eager to press on, yielded to their caution. The decision was fatal. Montgomery would never come. His men were already in retreat, their general lying dead in the snow. And while Morgan's men waited in the narrow streets, the defenders inside Quebec regrouped. Carleton, alerted to the breach, sent reinforcements rushing to the lower town. Muskets appeared at windows, cannons swiveled to cover alleys, rooftops bristled with fire. What had been a fleeting advantage dissolved into a trap. When Morgan finally ordered the advance, the streets erupted with British fire. Bullets rained down from above, soldiers collapsed in heaps, the snow stained with blood. The Americans fought desperately, returning fire, but they were hemmed in on all sides. The storm that had concealed them now blinded them. The city that seemed within reach became a labyrinth of death. Morgan, furious at the hesitation that had cost them victory, fought like a man possessed. He rallied his men again and again, urging them to charge through the storm of fire. His sword flashed in the snow. His voice roared above the din. For hours, he resisted, holding together the ragged survivors of Arnold's column. But numbers and position told. The British pressed in, cutting off every avenue of escape. By morning, the Americans were trapped. Surrounded, outnumbered, their ammunition nearly gone, they had no choice. At 9 o'clock, Morgan stood in the snow sword, still in his hand, and surrendered. Around 430 men laid down their arms, prisoners of war. Arnold, carried from the field with his shattered leg, raged at the news. He cursed. The hesitation cursed. The storm cursed fate itself. He had believed victory was within reach, only to see it snatched away. For Morgan, the surrender was bitter, but it was the only way to save the lives of the men who remained. The battle was over. What had begun with audacity ended in disaster. The Americans had fought with courage, but courage was not enough. Quebec's walls still stood, Carleton still commanded, and the Revolution's northern gamble lay broken in the snow. Yet in defeat, something remarkable endured. The men who had followed Arnold and Morgan had proven that determination could carry them farther than anyone thought possible. They had carved a path through wilderness, stormed barricades in a blizzard, and fought with a ferocity that astonished even their enemies. Though captured, wounded, or scattered, their defiance left a mark on the memory of the Revolution. But memory could not change reality. The Revolution would not claim Quebec, and the dream of Canada, once so bold, lay buried beneath the snow alongside the blood of the men who had charged into the storm. When Benedict Arnold was carried from the field, his legs shattered by a musket ball, command of the northern assault fell to Captain Daniel Morgan. It was a moment both unexpected and fateful. Morgan was not of noble birth, nor a polished officer trained in European academies. He was a rough-hewn Virginian, a man who had clawed his way upward from the frontier. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by hard labor and hard fights, he had once been whipped nearly to death by British officers for striking a superior. That memory never left him, and on this night in Quebec, the chance for vengeance burned within him. Morgan did not hesitate. With sword drawn, he strode into the storm, rallying Arnold's men with a booming voice that carried over the howl of the blizzard. They followed him instinctively, for here was a leader who demanded no obedience by title, only by presence. Musket balls whizzed past him, one grazing his cheek and another tearing through his hat. But Morgan pressed forward, shouting encouragement, urging his men to close with the enemy. The Americans surged against the first British barricade. It was a brutal fight, hand-to-hand, bayonet against bayonet, musket butt against musket butt. Snow mixed with blood as men grappled in the narrow streets, their shouts muffled by the storm. Morgan led from the front, his sword cutting through the chaos, his sheer ferocity pulling his men with him. Against the odds, they broke through. A British captain and his men were taken prisoner. Cheers rose from the ragged column. For the first time, it seemed that Quebec might truly be within their grasp. Momentum carried them deeper into the lower town. The streets twisted before them, narrow and treacherous, but the enemy had faltered. The prisoners were marched to the rear, and Morgan pressed on. Ahead, the city lay vulnerable. One more push, he believed, and the Americans could break into the heart of Quebec. Yet at the very moment of triumph, hesitation crept in. Morgan's officers, cautious and weary, urged restraint. They pointed to the prisoners, to the risk of being cut off in unfamiliar streets, to the absence of Montgomery's column, which was supposed to be striking from the south. We should wait, they argued. Join with Montgomery, then drive forward together. Morgan bristled. His instincts told him to strike now, while the defenders reeled. But even the fiercest leader must listen to his officers, especially in the chaos of battle. Against his better judgment, he paused. The men regrouped, guarded the prisoners, and waited in the storm for Montgomery, a commander, who was already lying dead in the snow. That pause cost everything. Inside the city, Governor Carleton seized the opportunity. Reports rushed in that Americans had broken through in the lower town, that barricades had fallen, that prisoners had been taken. Carleton acted with calm precision. Reinforcements were dispatched at once. Defenders flooded the streets ahead of Morgan muskets and cannon positioned at key choke points. What had been a moment of vulnerability for Quebec turned into a rallying cry. The defenders, emboldened by news of Montgomery's defeat, pressed to contain Morgan's men. When Morgan finally ordered the advance, he marched not into opportunity, but into a trap. As his column pushed forward, fire erupted from rooftops, windows, and barricades. Muskets cracked, cannon thundered, and men fell screaming into the snow. The narrow streets became killing grounds, their walls channeling the Americans into perfect lines of fire. Blood sprayed across white drifts, bodies slumped against frozen doorways, cries of pain drowned in the roar of battle. Morgan fought like a man possessed. He shouted above the din, rallied the wavering, and pressed his sword into the fray. More than once, he turned back men who faltered his presence alone enough to stiffen their resolve. He seemed untouchable, bullets grazing him but never striking true, as if fate mocked him with near misses. His men fought with equal fury, driven by loyalty to their captain and the sheer desperation of survival. But courage could not undo the trap. Carleton's reinforcements closed in from every side. Streets that had seemed open now filled with defenders. Barricades rose ahead, walls of musket fire erupted behind. The Americans found themselves hemmed in the blizzard that had once been their ally, now sealing them into a frozen cage. For hours, the battle raged in the lower town. The Americans clung to doorways, crouched behind barrels, returned fire whenever they could. The British pressed steadily, methodically, using their superior numbers and positions to grind the invaders down. Ammunition ran low, powder dampened by snow muskets misfired or fell silent. Men fought with bayonets, with fists, with sheer desperation. Morgan refused to yield. His voice, hoarse and raw, urged his men on long after hope had died. He led charges against barricades, only to be driven back by volleys of musket fire. He dragged the wounded into cover, cursed the storm, cursed fate, cursed the hesitation that had cost them their one chance. To those who fought beside him, Morgan seemed less a man than a force of defiance itself, unwilling to bow even as the noose tightened. But even the fiercest defiance cannot fight forever. By mid-morning, the trap had closed completely. Surrounded on all sides, his men dropping in heaps around him, Morgan saw the truth. There would be no breakthrough, no Montgomery marching to join him, no miracle in the storm. To fight on was to die pointlessly, to waste the lives of the men who still clung to his command. At 9 o'clock, with tears freezing on his cheeks, Daniel Morgan lowered his sword. He handed it to the British officers who stepped forward, his posture stiff with pride even in surrender. Around him, some 430 Americans laid down their arms. Exhausted, bloodied, their hopes shattered, they became prisoners of war. For Morgan, the humiliation was bitter. He had come within a hair's breadth of victory, only to see it stolen by hesitation, by misfortune, by the death of Montgomery far from his sight. Yet even in defeat, his reputation only grew. The courage he displayed that night, the near miraculous survival in the storm of bullets, the ferocity with which he led his men, all of it would become legend. Years later, on other battlefields, his name would inspire men again. But in Quebec on that morning, he was only another captive of fate. The Revolution's hopes for Canada bled into the snow that day. The pincer that was meant to crush Quebec had instead been broken apart, its jaws shattered before they could close. The Americans had fought with courage, with daring, with desperation. But courage alone could not breach Quebec's ancient walls, nor overcome Carleton's steady defense. For Carleton, Morgan's surrender was confirmation that his gamble had paid off. He had trusted winter fortifications and discipline over rashness, and he had been vindicated. Quebec still stood, and with it, Britain's dominion in Canada. For the Americans, Morgan's moment, brief, brilliant, and doomed, was the last glimmer of hope. After his surrender, the dream of taking Quebec flickered out like a candle smothered by wind. The surrender of Daniel Morgan was not the end of the fighting in Quebec, but it was the moment the outcome became inevitable. By the morning of December 31st, 1775, the storm had passed, the blizzard's fury easing into a pale gray dawn. Snowdrifts rose high against the barricades, crimson streaks marking where men had fallen. Smoke curled above rooftops, musket fire cracked in scattered bursts, and the cries of the wounded drifted faintly through narrow streets. The battle was broken, but its echoes lingered. For the British victory was now a matter of mopping up. Carleton, who had watched the night unfold with the calm precision of a chess master, moved swiftly to consolidate. His reinforcements swept into the lower town, securing intersections, herding prisoners, and silencing the last pockets of resistance. Muskets bristled from every window, cannon mouths pointed down frozen alleys, and loyalist militia prowled like hunters. The Americans, exhausted and cornered, had no path forward and no escape behind. The trap had closed perfectly. Arnold, lying in agony from his leg wound, raged as he heard the news. From his improvised stretcher, he shouted orders, cursed his fate, and begged his men to press on. But they could not. Morgan was captured, Montgomery was dead, and the army was broken. Arnold's fury, though unquenchable, could not change the reality the northern assault had failed. For the men still in the fight, the scene was a nightmare of confusion. Some barricaded themselves in houses, firing from windows until ammunition ran out. Others huddled behind overturned carts or snowbanks, muskets clutched in trembling hands. But everywhere, British volleys crashed into them, relentless, disciplined, methodical. The defenders had the advantage of numbers, position, and morale. The Americans had only desperation left. When at last the firing subsided, the toll became clear. Around 60 Americans lay dead, their bodies stiffening in the snow. 34 more were wounded, their cries carried on the freezing air. Most devastating of all, nearly 430 were taken prisoner, a staggering number for an army that had numbered barely 1,000 at the outset. By contrast, the British had lost only 5 men dead and 13 wounded. The disparity was cruel, a brutal reminder that courage does not always balance the scales of war. Carleton treated his prisoners with restraint, if not generosity. They were herded into makeshift quarters, given rations, and held under guard. Among them were hardened wilderness veterans, men who had marched with Arnold through hellish forests, now humbled and captive. Their faces were hollow, their clothes tattered, their bodies marked by frostbite. To their captors, they seemed more specters than soldiers. Montgomery's body was recovered with solemnity. Carleton, recognizing valor even in an enemy, ensured he was buried with respect. The fallen general became a symbol not of defeat, but of sacrifice. His name soon to be spoken in taverns and pulpits across the colonies. But for the men who had followed him, his loss was devastating. The darling of the army, Washington, would later call him gone in a flash of grapeshot. The immediate effect on the American camp was one of despair. Those who had not been captured huddled in their huts outside Quebec, their numbers thinned, their supplies scarce, their hope drained. Snow piled high against their crude shelters. Winds howled through cracks in canvas, and hunger gnawed at bellies. They had marched into Canada dreaming of a 14th colony. They now shivered in the wilderness, reduced to survivors clinging to life. Arnold, though wounded, refused to abandon the cause entirely. Propped up by crutches, his leg bandaged and throbbing, he limped through the camp, rallying what men remained. His determination was unbroken, his pride unbowed. "We will not retreat," he vowed. "We will hold through the winter." His voice carried a fierce defiance that kept the remnants together. Yet even he must have known the truth. Quebec was untouchable. The fortress city had withstood their best effort, and reinforcements from Britain would soon arrive to sweep them away. Inside Quebec, the defenders celebrated with relief. They had faced an audacious assault and survived. Carleton's calm leadership was praised. The militia's loyalty confirmed, the city's walls vindicated. For the inhabitants, both British loyalists and cautious French Canadians, the victory restored confidence. Quebec had been tested and proved unbreakable. The psychological blow to the revolution was severe. The American dream of seizing Canada had rested on this single campaign, and it had ended in disaster. Instead of liberating a 14th colony, they had left hundreds of their best men in British captivity, lost one of their most promising generals, and revealed the limits of their young rebellion. And yet, as often in war, defeat did not end the struggle. Even shattered, the Americans refused to vanish. Arnold held the line through the winter defiant despite dwindling supplies and sagging morale. His stubbornness alone prevented Carleton from sweeping out of Quebec to crush them entirely. But it was a hollow resistance marked not by victory, but by survival. By May of 1776, the stalemate was broken. British reinforcements arrived in strength, thousands of fresh troops led by General John Burgoyne. Faced with overwhelming force, Arnold and the remnants of his army had no choice but to retreat. On June 18th, Arnold was the last American to leave Canada, limping away still hungry for victory, but carrying only bitterness. The campaign was over. The invasion of Canada, born of audacity and fueled by desperation, had ended in humiliation. The revolution had tested its limits and found them in the walls of Quebec. But memory is not always bound by outcome. Though defeated, the story of Arnold's wilderness march, of Montgomery's death, of Morgan's defiance, became part of the revolutionary legend. It was proof that Americans had dared what no one thought possible, to strike at the heart of an empire in its northern stronghold. They had failed, but they had failed gloriously, their courage remembered even when their cause had faltered. For Britain, the victory ensured that Canada would remain firmly under the crown. For the Americans, it was a lesson in the price of ambition and the unforgiving reality of war. And for the men who survived, it was a memory carved into their bones of snow and fire, of comrades lost, of dreams buried beneath the walls of Quebec. Encircled, defeated, humiliated, the Americans left behind not conquest, but a story of human endurance and the harsh limits of hope. The dawn of 1776 brought no glory to the American army outside Quebec. The blizzard had passed, the cannons had fallen silent, but the camp beyond the walls was little more than a frozen graveyard of hopes. The defeat on the last night of December had shattered the invasion's momentum, leaving behind a remnant army that clung to survival more than to strategy. Benedict Arnold, now crippled by his leg wound, refused to abandon the field. He hobbled through the snow on crutches, bandages seeping through his breeches, his jaw set with unyielding pride. To retreat was unthinkable, not while the revolution still needed a foothold in Canada. "We will hold," he insisted, rallying what men remained. His voice carried the same recklessness that had driven him through the wilderness, the same defiance that had led him into the storm. But no voice, however fierce, could banish the misery of that winter. The camp outside Quebec became a place of suffering. Tents sagged under heavy snow, their canvas stiff with frost. Fires smoldered weakly, barely holding back the cold. Food was scarce. Rations dwindled to scraps of salt pork and moldy bread. Disease spread like wildfire. Smallpox crept through the ranks, laying men low with fever and pustules. The once hopeful army dwindled day by day, not by British bullets, but by hunger, cold, and sickness. Inside, Quebec life was harsh but secure. Carleton kept his men disciplined, his supplies rationed, his defenses vigilant. The citizens, though weary, drew strength from the knowledge that the city had withstood the storm. The French Canadians, who had watched the American approach with wary silence, now withdrew even further. The revolution had promised liberation, but what they saw outside the walls were men starving, freezing, and dying in droves. The dream of brotherhood between New England farmers and French Canadian habitants dissolved in the frost. Through January. February. Arnold's camp withered. Reinforcements trickled in from the south, but they were too few and too sick to change the balance. The Americans still held positions beyond the walls, but their presence was little more than symbolic. Every day, men deserted, slipping back across the snow in search of survival. Letters written from the camp spoke of despair. One soldier wrote, "We are reduced to skeletons. Our cause here is lost." Yet still, Arnold held on. His stubbornness alone kept the army intact. Washington's letters encouraged him, Congress demanded perseverance, and Arnold clung to the belief that one more effort, one more stroke of fortune, might still turn the tide. But history is merciless. The tide had already turned. In May, the inevitable came. The St. Lawrence thawed, and with it came sails, not the sails of American reinforcements, but of British warships. General John Burgoyne arrived with nearly 4,000 fresh troops, red-coated regulars, whose discipline and firepower dwarfed anything Arnold could muster. Alongside them came supplies, artillery, and the promise of renewed offensive power. The balance of the campaign had shifted irrevocably. The Americans had no choice. Arnold, bitter but realistic, ordered a retreat. On May 6th, the remnants of the invasion abandoned their positions and began the long march south. They left behind the bodies of the dead, the graves of comrades lost to disease, the shattered dreams of conquest. Quebec remained unbroken, its flag still flying proudly above its walls. The retreat was as brutal as the invasion had been. Starving men staggered through the forest, some barefoot, others crippled by frostbite. Smallpox ravaged the ranks, cutting swaths through the weakened columns. By the time they reached relative safety, they were shadows of the army that had once dared to dream of Canada. On June 18, 1776, Benedict Arnold himself was the last American to leave Canadian soil. He limped aboard a boat on Lake Champlain, his legs still scarred his pride, still defiant. For him, the campaign was not just a military failure, but a personal wound. He had poured his courage and ambition into Canada, and it had repaid him with pain, humiliation, and loss. That bitterness would fester in the years to come, shaping the choices that would one day make his name synonymous with betrayal. For the Revolution, the consequences were clear. The Northern gamble had failed. Canada would remain under the British Crown, not as a 14th colony, but as a loyal neighbor to the Empire. The Americans had discovered the limits of their reach, the fragility of their armies, the harshness of campaigning beyond their borders. And yet, even in failure, the invasion left behind a strange kind of legacy. The courage of Arnold's march through the wilderness, the sacrifice of Montgomery before Quebec's walls, the defiance of Daniel Morgan in the Lower Town, these became stories retold across the colonies. They were failures, yes, but noble failures, reminders that the Revolution's spirit was unyielding even when the odds were hopeless. The dream of Canada may have died in the snow, but the lesson of daring lived on. Historians still debate whether the campaign could ever have succeeded. Some argue that even had Quebec fallen, the Americans lacked the resources to hold it against Britain's inevitable reinforcements. Others imagine an alternate history where Canada joined the Revolution, tipping the balance of power in America's favor. What remains undeniable is that in the winter of 1775-1776, the Revolution gambled boldly and lost. The broken dream of Canada lingered like a ghost. For decades, Americans would look north and wonder what might have been. For the French Canadians who watched from their farms and villages, the campaign confirmed their caution. Better to endure under the British Crown than to gamble on the uncertain promises of a foreign rebellion. The wedge between the two peoples, once narrow, widened into permanence. Montgomery lay in his honored grave. Arnold nursed his bitterness. Morgan carried his legend into captivity, and the Revolution turned its eyes elsewhere. The war would be fought and won in the colonies, not in Canada. But the story of that invasion of snow and fire, of courage and defeat, remained etched into memory. The Revolution had reached for Canada, and Canada had refused. The snow outside Quebec became its witness, the storm its shroud, the silence of its dead its final epitaph. The dream was broken, but the fight for American independence marched on.